Welcome to this discussion about one of the most pressing and fascinating shifts happening quietly across the world. Why will the next generation likely turn away from religion? Why will so many of our children grow up without the beliefs that shaped entire civilizations for thousands of years? This is not a prediction made lightly. It's a conclusion supported by data, culture, psychology, and the direction society is moving in every single day. When you look at the patterns across history, you see something striking. Beliefs change more slowly than technology, but they do change. There was a time when people could not imagine life without kings, without absolute monarchs ordained by God. That era ended. There was a time when slavery was justified through Scripture, considered natural and eternal. That era ended too. Today we look at those past certainties and wonder how anyone accepted them. In the same way, future generations will look at absolute religious authority and see something strange, something that no longer fits the world they live in. The numbers already tell the story. Surveys across Europe, North America, parts of Asia, and even regions long considered bastions of faith show the same trend. Fewer people attend religious services. Fewer identify with any organized religion, and among the young, belief in traditional doctrines is collapsing at an unprecedented pace. In some countries, like Sweden or the Czech Republic, those who claim no religion are already the majority. In the United States, long seen as deeply religious, the number of people who call themselves nuns, meaning no religious affiliation, has surged to nearly 30%. And among Gen Z, that figure is even higher. In South Korea, in Canada, in Australia, the same pattern repeats. And here's the critical point. Belief rarely bounces back. When a generation lets go of old certainties, they almost never return to them in adulthood. So what is driving this change? It's easy to point to technology, the internet, social media, access to information, and yes, that matters. A child today can learn in minutes what a scholar centuries ago might never have encountered in a lifetime. Questions that once seemed dangerous or forbidden are now a click away. When a teenager asks, "Why does a good God allow suffering?" they no longer have to accept the single answer their community offers. They can explore philosophy, science, history, and countless perspectives instantly. That alone weakens the monopoly that religion once held over truth. But the internet is only part of the story. The deeper forces go beyond screens and algorithms. They reach into the very fabric of modern life. Think about morality. For centuries, religions claimed to be the source of ethics, warning that without God, society would collapse into chaos. Yet today, some of the most secular nations, Denmark, Norway, Japan, rank among the safest, most stable, and most compassionate on Earth. Crime rates are low, life expectancy is high, education is strong, and social trust thrives. These are not perfect societies, but they prove a point. Morality does not require faith. Children growing up in this world see that goodness, fairness, and cooperation are possible without divine command. And once you see that, it's hard to believe that morality depends on a supernatural lawgiver. Let me recap after my CPD run. Another factor is science, not just as a body of knowledge, but as a way of thinking. Our children live in a world where almost every aspect of life, from medicine to technology, rests on evidence, testing, and reason. They see that natural explanations work. Germ theory explains disease better than curses. Astronomy explains the stars better than myth. When explanations grounded in observation succeed again and again, and when those explanations make life better, curing illnesses, extending lifespans, connecting people across the globe, it becomes harder to accept stories that cannot be tested or verified. Faith asks for trust without evidence. Science earns trust through proof. That difference grows clearer every day to young minds raised in an age of instant fact-checking. But there is something even more personal shaping this shift. Authenticity. Younger generations value being true to themselves more than any before. They distrust institutions, question authority, and crave transparency. They grew up watching scandals, Religious leaders exposed for corruption, abuse, hypocrisy. They saw how often those who preached virtue failed to live by it. These revelations cut deep, because when an institution claims to speak for the ultimate truth, yet hides crimes or silences questions, it destroys its own credibility, and young people notice. Once that trust is broken, it rarely returns. There's also the weight of diversity. Children today grow up in classrooms, on social media, in communities where they encounter people of every belief system or none at all. They see Muslims, Christians, Hindus, atheists, and Buddhists working side by side, living good lives, loving their families. That experience plants a simple but powerful question. If these different paths all lead to decent human beings, can any one of them be the only truth? In a globalized world, exclusive looks less like confidence and more like arrogance. And children who prize fairness struggle with the idea that billions of people deserve eternal punishment simply for being born into the wrong culture. Education plays its role too. In more places than ever, children learn about evolution, cosmology, psychology, fields that offer natural explanations for questions once reserved for religion. When a child understands that humans share DNA with every living thing, that our planet is billions of years old, that consciousness emerges from the brain, those insights reshape how they see themselves and their place in the universe. The old narratives lose their grip, not because anyone forces them out, but because they no longer fit the evidence. And then there is suffering, the hardest question any belief system faces. In an age where disasters, diseases, and atrocities are documented in real time, children cannot avoid the reality of pain. They see innocent people crushed by earthquakes, families torn apart by war, children dying from hunger while others thrive in luxury. And they ask, where is the justice? Where is the loving, all-powerful force that permits this? The answers religion gives often sound hollow to modern ears. It's a mystery, or it's part of a plan, feels like a dismissal, not an explanation. For many young people, these answers push them not toward deeper faith, but away from it. Does this mean the future will be a world without any sense of wonder or meaning? Not at all. The human hunger for meaning is real, but that hunger no longer needs to be fed by dogma. It can be nourished by curiosity, by art, by human connection, by the beauty of the natural world. A child who looks up at the night sky and knows they are a pattern of atoms born in the hearts of stars may feel awe, deeper than any scripture ever offered. A teenager who understands the fragility of life may cherish it more fiercely, not because of a promised eternity, but because it is finite and precious. The rise of atheism among the young is not a rebellion against morality or purpose. It's a move toward honesty. It's a recognition that inherited answers don't always fit the questions of today. And this shift is not about destroying traditions. It's about freeing individuals to seek truth without fear. When a child can question openly, explore widely, and build their values on reason and empathy rather than coercion, that is not a loss, it's progress. So yes, many of our children will be atheists, not because they hate faith, but because the world they inhabit makes old certainties harder to sustain. They will grow up surrounded by evidence, by diversity, by unprecedented freedom to think for themselves. And in that freedom, they will see that meaning does not need to be handed down from above. It can rise from within, from the lives we build, the connections we cherish, the truths we discover together. That is the future taking shape before our eyes. Look at what's happening across different regions. In Western Europe, belief has been eroding for decades. Countries like Norway, Iceland, and the Netherlands are now majority non-religious, and they didn't become immoral wastelands when faith declined. On the contrary, these nations consistently rank highest in happiness, education, gender equality, and quality of life. Children in these societies grow up seeing that you don't need divine commandments to build a humane world. They don't fear eternal punishment, yet they live with a strong sense of social responsibility. That observation alone challenges the idea that morality collapses without religion. Even in the United States, a country long viewed as a stronghold of faith, the numbers are striking. Just a few decades ago, nearly 90% of Americans identified with a religion. Today, that figure has dropped to around 65%, and among Gen Z, the youngest adults, up to 40% claim no religious affiliation. That's not a small shift. That's a cultural earthquake in slow motion. The future doesn't belong to rigid dogmas because those dogmas cannot compete with a connected global world where ideas flow freely. Now look at Asia. Japan is often cited as one of the least religious nations on earth. Most people there don't frame life in terms of sin, salvation, or eternal reward. Yet Japan has a deeply ethical culture. This shows something important. Humans are naturally capable of building moral systems without supernatural beliefs. South Korea, once deeply conservative, is seeing a similar trend among its youth, even in places like India or the Middle East, where religion still dominates public life. Cracks are forming beneath the surface. Social media platforms reveal conversations that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Young people questioning practices, challenging authority, asking why faith should dictate their private choices. Many stay quiet publicly because of stigma or laws, but the change has begun, and when a cultural tide starts with the youth, history shows it rarely reverses. Why is this happening now, on such a large scale? Part of it is exposure. The old village life, where everyone believed the same things, is gone. Today, a teenager in Cairo can debate with someone in London in real time. They can read arguments from philosophers, watch documentaries about evolution, learn what neuroscience says about consciousness. The gatekeepers of information have lost control, and that changes everything. In the past, questioning faith often meant isolation, punishment, even death. Today, it means joining a global conversation. And that conversation is growing louder every year. But there's also something deeper, something psychological. Many of the fears that once drove belief have weakened. In earlier centuries, life was brutally short. Disease, famine, and war were constant threats. Religion offered comfort, a sense of order in chaos. But modern life, despite its flaws, is safer. Medicine defeats plagues that once wiped out millions. Technology shields us from the harshness of nature. We no longer need to pray for rain. We build irrigation systems. We no longer beg for healing. We develop vaccines. When human effort solves the problems that faith once claimed to answer, the grip of superstition loosens. This doesn't mean life is easy. Anxiety and uncertainty still exist, maybe more than ever. But here's the difference. Our children are not told that suffering is punishment or that questioning is sin. They are told to seek therapy, to understand the mind, to look at causes and solutions rooted in reality. That shift is profound. It means the default response to crisis is no longer pray harder, but analyze, adapt, and act. And every time that approach works, it reinforces the idea that human reason is enough. Another reason the next generation will turn away from religion is the collapse of fear-based control. For centuries, religions held power by framing life as a test with eternal consequences, heaven or hell, salvation or damnation. But younger minds raised on evidence-based thinking find those threats hollow. The concept of eternal punishment for finite mistakes feels unjust, even absurd. They ask, why would an all-loving being demand blind loyalty under threat of torture? And when the answers sound like excuses rather than explanations, belief fades. Then there's identity. In a world where personal freedom is celebrated, where authenticity is a core value, rigid doctrines clash with self-expression. A generation that embraces gender diversity, scientific literacy, and individual autonomy will not easily conform to institutions that tell them who they must love, how they must think, or what questions they're allowed to ask. Religion, for many young people, feels less like guidance and more like a cage. And cages, no matter how ornate, cannot hold those who have tasted freedom. Of course, some will argue that without religion, life becomes meaningless. But that argument collapses under scrutiny. Meaning is not handed down from the sky. It is built from within. Ask people who have left faith whether their lives feel empty, and most will say the opposite. They feel lighter, freer, more authentic. They find meaning in relationships, in creativity, in contributing to a better world. And their children, growing up without dogma, start life with that freedom from the beginning. They don't inherit the fear of eternal judgment or the guilt of human imperfection. They inherit possibility. This shift is not without resistance. Institutions with centuries of power do not fade quietly. We see backlash in politics, in laws, in cultural battles over schools and rights. But history shows that backlash is often a sign of decline, not strength. The louder the outcry, the deeper the fear of irrelevance. And irrelevance is coming, not because anyone wages war on faith, but because faith struggles to compete with reality. You can legislate rituals, but you cannot legislate belief. And belief is where the change is happening. In quiet conversations, in late-night thoughts, in the private decisions of millions who choose reason over ritual. When we talk about our children being atheists, we're not predicting a world without values. We're predicting a world where values are grounded in empathy, evidence, and shared humanity instead of divine command. That world is already forming piece by piece, in the classrooms, in the social networks, in the homes where parents teach their children to question, to think, to care without fear. And the most striking thing? This future will not feel radical to those who live in it. It will feel normal, just as democracy feels normal to us now, though once it was seen as dangerous, just as equality feels obvious now, though once it was heresy. Our grandchildren will look back at a time when people divided over gods and doctrines and wonder how anyone thought that was necessary. To them, humanity united by reason and compassion will feel as natural as breathing. One of the biggest questions people ask when they hear predictions of a post-religious world is this: if religion fades, what will take its place? What will give people purpose, comfort, and a sense of belonging? For many, the fear is that removing faith leaves a void, a hollow existence where nothing matters. But that fear misunderstands something fundamental. The need for meaning is not disappearing. It is as strong as ever. What's changing is where people look to satisfy it. Think about what religion historically provided: a moral framework, a sense of community, an explanation for the unknown, and rituals that gave life rhythm and significance. These were never supernatural necessities. They were human needs. And human needs adapt. Today, those same needs are being met in new ways. Ethics no longer require sacred texts. They can be grounded in empathy, in the understanding that well-being flourishes when we act with fairness and compassion. Science gives us not only knowledge, but also humility, a recognition that the universe is vast and complex, far beyond our complete grasp. Communities no longer need to gather in temples to share solidarity. They form around ideas, causes, and passions. A person who joins a climate activism group or volunteers at a shelter finds connection and purpose without reciting creeds. Even rituals persist, though in different forms. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, these moments give structure to our lives. They may lack divine sanction, but they carry meaning because we give them meaning. Humans have always created symbols to express what words cannot. That creativity will not vanish because doctrine does. If anything, it will grow richer, because it will be shaped by freedom rather than fear. And then there is wonder. Critics often claim that without religion, the world becomes cold and empty, stripped of mystery. But this claim collapses the moment you look at reality through scientific eyes. What could be more awe-inspiring than knowing that every atom in your body was forged in the heart of a dying star? What could stir more humility than standing under a sky filled with galaxies, each containing billions of suns, knowing that light from some of them began its journey before life existed on Earth? For a child raised without dogma, These are not sterile facts. They are revelations. They speak of a universe not small and controlled, but vast and evolving. And the beauty is that this wonder does not require closing your eyes in prayer. It requires opening them to what is real. Now let's talk about the psychological freedom that comes with shedding rigid belief systems. One of the heaviest burdens religion often imposes is the weight of guilt. Guilt for thoughts, for desires, for being human. Many grow up believing they are fundamentally broken and need salvation to be whole. That narrative shapes self-worth in damaging ways. When children inherit it, they learn to fear themselves, to distrust their own nature. Breaking free from that is like stepping out of a cage you didn't know was there. Suddenly, mistakes become lessons instead of sins. Curiosity becomes strength instead of rebellion. Life stops feeling like an exam and starts feeling like an opportunity. This freedom also changes how we view death. Religion promises immortality to soothe the fear of mortality, but it also uses that promise to control behavior. Without that promise, death seems terrifying at first, but over time, something shifts. Life becomes more precious precisely because it is finite. When you know your days are limited, every moment gains weight. You cherish relationships more deeply, you savor experiences more fully, and you pour meaning into the time you have instead of banking on an eternity you cannot see. That shift is profound. It turns urgency into creativity, gratitude into a daily practice, and existence into something luminous rather than something to endure for a future reward. Of course, a secular future is not without challenges. Some worry about the rise of nihilism. If there is no ultimate purpose, why bother at all? But this fear misunderstands where purpose comes from. It was never written in the stars. It was never dictated by gods. It was always something humans created together. The difference now is that this creation is conscious. When someone says, "I live for my family," or "I live to create art," they are not lost. They are alive to the truth that meaning is made, not given, and that realization doesn't weaken us. It empowers us. Others fear that without religion, morality will collapse, but the evidence points the other way. Secular societies tend to have lower crime rates, higher literacy, stronger protections for human rights. Why? Because morality, rooted in empathy and reason, is more adaptable than morality frozen in ancient codes. When ethics grow from understanding consequences rather than fearing punishment, they evolve with knowledge. That's why modern secular laws protect rights for groups that were once marginalized, while some religious traditions still resist equality. Progress does not wait for dogma to catch up. Now think about how children absorb this. A child who grows up in a world where questions are encouraged instead of silenced learns intellectual courage. A child who sees diversity as normal learns tolerance. A child who experiences morality as care rather than command learns responsibility. These traits do not fade, they shape entire cultures. And as more children grow up this way, societies tilt toward openness, dialogue, and innovation. This trend does not mean all religion will vanish. Traditions will persist, adapted to new realities. Some will keep faith as a personal practice rather than a system of control. And that is not necessarily harmful. The real change is that belief will no longer dominate public life or dictate private choices. It will become one voice among many, not the voice that claims to speak for all. That is the difference between a world ruled by dogma and a world shaped by shared humanity. So when we say our children will be atheists, we're not predicting a barren cultural landscape. We're visioning a world rich with meaning, rooted in reality, where awe is not diminished but deepened, where morality is not enforced by fear but built on empathy, and where freedom is not an abstract ideal but a lived experience. That future is not a dream. It is already being built, one questioning mind at a time. If our children grow up without the frameworks that shaped so many past generations, What does that mean for the future of culture, education, politics, and even the way we love? These questions matter because when belief systems shift, everything else follows, and the answers may surprise you. They point not to decline, but to transformation. Not with education. In a world less tied to dogma, classrooms become spaces for genuine inquiry rather than indoctrination. Knowledge is not filtered through the lens of what must never be questioned. Students can explore evolution without conflict, psychology without shame, and ethics without fear of eternal consequences. This creates generations trained not to memorize answers, but to ask better questions. And when questioning becomes a virtue rather than a sin, societies innovate faster. They solve problems not by appealing to authority, but by testing ideas. That mindset, critical, open, evidence-driven, has already fueled revolutions in science and technology. In the future, it will shape everything from climate policy to medicine to space exploration. Now consider politics. When people no longer view laws as divine commands, they evaluate them by their real-world impact. Does this policy reduce harm? Does it increase well-being? Does it protect freedom without crushing fairness? These are rational questions, and they lead to rational debates. Compare that to systems where legislation is rooted in scripture. Progress stalls because any change feels like rebellion against heaven. In a secular world, morality becomes a matter of shared responsibility, not divine decree. And that shift matters when facing global crises. You cannot solve climate change with prayer alone. You cannot fight pandemics with ritual. These problems require cooperation grounded in reason, not tribal loyalty to competing gods. Even relationships change when religious structures fade. For much of history, marriage was not just a union of two people, it was a religious contract. Gender roles were justified as divine law. Divorce was condemned as sin. Sexuality outside rigid norms was demonized. But when morality is detached from dogma, relationships can be built on consent, respect, and equality rather than fear. This does not destroy families. It strengthens them, because bonds formed from choice, not coercion, are more resilient. A child raised in such a world sees love not as obligation, but as partnership. They learn that loyalty is not fear of punishment, but a gift freely given. That redefinition ripples outward into culture, shaping art, literature, and every story we tell about what it means to be human. What about meaning? Critics insist that without God, life becomes empty, but reality suggests the opposite. A life understood as finite becomes more urgent, more vivid. Knowing that existence is brief does not make it shallow, it makes it precious. People in secular societies often describe a deeper sense of responsibility, not to appease a deity, but to one another and to future generations. This is meaning that does not collapse under doubt because it does not depend on unseen worlds. It depends on choices we make here and now. The long-term cultural consequence of this shift may be the rise of what some call horizontal transcendence. Instead of looking upward for purpose, we look outward. To nature, to art, to human connection. The feeling of awe that once belonged to cathedrals is found in mountain ranges, in symphonies, in the staggering beauty of a night sky untouched by city lights. The impulse that once built temples now builds research labs, humanitarian projects, and creative movement. Wonder doesn't vanish, it changes direction. And that change might produce a culture richer, not poorer, in depth and inspiration. There will, of course, be resistance. Tradition has deep roots, and those invested in old hierarchies will fight to preserve them. Some will predict chaos, insisting that without faith, morality will collapse and society will disintegrate. But history tells a different story. When the divine right of kings ended, society did not fall apart. It progressed. When slavery was abolished, civilization did not crumble, it advanced. Every major liberation feels like a threat to those who benefit from the old order. But in time, it becomes the new normal. And so it will be with this. The real challenge for a post-religious future is not how to replace God. It is how to cultivate wisdom without dogma, meaning without myths, solidarity without superstition. That is not an easy task, but it is a human task. And we are capable of it, because the very fact that religion existed proves we have always been creators of meaning. The difference now is that we can do it consciously, free from fear, guided by empathy and reason. When you step back and see the full picture, the conclusion is clear. The world our children inherit will not be perfect, but it will be freer. It will be a world where questions are not punished, where diversity is not feared, where morality is not frozen in texts written millennia ago, but grows with our understanding of life. That world is being born quietly in classrooms, in online forums, in families that teach their children to think rather than obey, and those children will teach their children the same. So yes, our children will likely be atheists, not because they reject hope, but because they refuse illusions. They will believe in something harder and more beautiful than dogma, the power of human choice, the wonder of reality, and the shared responsibility of building a life that matters. Not in heaven, but here, where life is fragile, brief, and astonishingly precious. Thank you for staying until the end. Share your thoughts below. Do you see this future coming? And what do you think we gain when fear gives way to freedom?